My name is Sarah. I'm 29 years old, and I work as a public school teacher. Last weekend, I attended my brother's engagement party at his fiancée's family estate. I wore a modest blue dress and told myself I would stay quiet, smile politely, and get through the evening without any trouble. But about an hour in, my future sister-in-law stood up from her chair, looked straight at me across the table, and laughed. "That's my fiancé's sister," she announced to everyone. "Don't worry about her, she's just a teacher. You know, crayons and nap time." A few people chuckled. Someone near the end of the table muttered something I couldn't quite hear. I didn't respond. I just smiled and looked down at my plate. But then something unexpected happened. Across the room, a man in a dark blazer stopped mid-conversation. He turned slowly and looked at me, not casually, the way people glance around a party, but carefully, like he was trying to place a face he hadn't seen in a very long time. Before I can tell you what he said, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to HeartPath Stories. It means everything to us. Now let me tell you the whole story from the beginning. The party was held at the Calloway family's property in Connecticut, about 40 minutes outside the city. My brother Daniel had been dating Victoria Calloway for almost 2 years, and this engagement party was the first time our two families were officially meeting. I had driven up alone that evening. Our mother had a migraine and stayed home, and our father passed away years ago, so it was just me representing our side of the family. I remember pulling into the long gravel driveway and feeling immediately out of place. The house wasn't really a house. It was the kind of property you see in lifestyle magazines: wide green lawns, a stone fountain at the entrance, string lights hanging between tall oak trees. A valet took my car. I thanked him quietly and walked toward the sound of voices and soft jazz coming from the back of the property. The patio was already full of people. Round tables with white tablecloths and tall floral centerpieces filled the space. Waiters moved between guests carrying trays of wine and small appetizers. I recognized a few distant relatives of ours near the far end, but most of the faces were unfamiliar Victoria's world, not mine. Daniel found me within a few minutes. He looked happy, genuinely happy, and I was glad for him. He introduced me to a few people, kept his hand on my shoulder for a moment, and then got pulled away by Victoria's mother, who seemed to have a very organized agenda for the evening. I didn't mind. I found a seat at one of the tables near the garden edge, accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter, and settled in. Victoria's family was wealthy in the kind of way that doesn't need to announce itself, it just exists in the details. The silverware was real. The flowers were fresh, not artificial. The guests wore things that had no visible price tags because people who buy those things never need to check them. I wasn't uncomfortable exactly, just aware of the distance between my daily life and this one. My daily life looked like this. I wake up at 5:45 inches the morning. I pack my bag, drive to Lincoln Elementary on the east side of the city, and spend the next 8 hours with 23 third graders who need more from a single adult than most people realize. I tie shoes. I explain fractions 4 different ways until the right one clicks for the right kid. I sit with children who are crying because something happened at home that morning and they don't have the words for it yet. I write notes to parents. I stay late. I do it again the next day. I don't do it for the salary. I do it because I genuinely believe that what happens in a classroom between a child and a caring teacher can change the entire direction of a life. I had believed that since I was a teenager, and nothing had changed my mind. But to Victoria, I was just Daniel's quiet sister who taught little kids. I had met her 4 or 5 times before that evening. She was always polite to my face, in the way that some people are polite because they've been raised to perform politeness rather than feel it. She would ask how work was going and then answer her own phone before I finished responding. She would compliment my outfit in a tone that made me wonder if she meant it. I never said anything about it to Daniel because he was happy, and making someone you love doubt their happiness isn't something I was willing to do. That evening, about an hour after the party started, the dinner service began. Guests moved to their assigned seats, and for the first time the two families were seated near each other at the central table. I was placed toward the end, between a woman I didn't know and an empty chair that was later occupied by a man named Gerald, who turned out to be a family friend of the Callaways. Victoria stood up partway through the first course. She tapped her champagne glass lightly with one finger and smiled at the table. "I just want to take a moment," she said, "to introduce a few of the people here who haven't met yet." She went around the table, her aunt from Boston, a college roommate, her father's business partner. And then she turned toward our end of the table and looked at me with that same practiced smile I had come to recognize. "And that," she said, tilting her glass slightly in my direction, "is Daniel's sister, Sarah." She paused just a half second too long, the way someone does when they're enjoying the setup. "She's just a teacher. Elementary school." She laughed lightly. "Crayons, gold stars, you know how it is." A few people at the table laughed politely. One of Victoria's cousins smiled into her wine glass. Someone at the far end said, "Oh, how sweet," in a tone that wasn't particularly sweet. I felt the familiar heat rise in my chest, that particular kind of embarrassment that comes not from being caught doing something wrong, but from being reduced to something small in front of people who don't know you well enough. To push back. I kept my face calm. I smiled briefly and looked back at my plate. I had been in enough uncomfortable situations to know that reacting rarely helps and almost always makes things worse. The conversation at the table continued. Someone asked about the honeymoon plans. Victoria mentioned Italy. The moment passed, or I thought it did. But then I noticed the man across from me had stopped eating. His name, I would later learn, was Richard. He was in his early 60s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of quiet, measured presence that suggests someone who has been in enough serious rooms to stop needing to prove anything. He was a business associate of Victoria's father. I overheard that much earlier in the evening. He had been pleasant at dinner, asked me a few polite questions about where I was from, that kind of thing. But now he wasn't eating. He was looking at me. Not rudely. Not with any particular expression I could name. Just looking. The way you look when a song comes on that you can't immediately identify, but you know you've heard it somewhere before, and it matters. I noticed it but didn't say anything. I looked away. The conversation continued around us. A few minutes passed. Victoria was talking about the villa they'd rented in Tuscany. Her mother was asking about photographer arrangements. Daniel laughed at something one of the groomsmen said. The evening was moving the way parties move forward, with its own momentum, one moment folding into the next. But across the table, Richard was still thinking about something. He set his fork down quietly. He picked up his water glass, put it back without drinking. He looked at me once more, and this time he seemed closer to whatever he was reaching for in his memory. I felt the attention without knowing what to do with it. Finally, he leaned forward slightly. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice low enough that only our end of the table heard it first. "But can I ask, do you teach on the east side of the city?" The question surprised me. "Yes," I said. "Lincoln Elementary." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, third grade?" The table nearby had gone a little quieter. A few people turned. "Yes," I said again, more carefully now. "For the past 4 years." Richard leaned back in his chair. He exhaled slowly, like a man who has just confirmed something he wasn't entirely sure he'd remembered correctly. He looked at the tablecloth for a moment, then back up at me. When he spoke again, his voice was composed, but there was something behind it, something that had weight. "I thought so," he said quietly. Daniel looked over. "You two know each other?" Richard shook his head slightly. "Not exactly." He looked at me. "But I know who you are." The table had gone noticeably quieter by then. Victoria had stopped mid-sentence about Tuscany. Her mother set her fork down. Even the soft jazz from the speakers seemed to recede slightly, the way sound does when you become suddenly aware of something more important than the background. Richard turned slightly toward the table so that more people could hear him. His voice stayed calm. "About 3 years ago," he said, "my grandson was a student at Lincoln Elementary." He paused for a moment. "His name is Marcus. He was in 3rd grade. His parents, my daughter, and her husband were going through an extremely difficult time that year. A divorce. A lot of upheaval at home. Marcus was 8 years old and he was struggling in ways that 8-year-olds shouldn't have to struggle. He stopped talking in class. His grades collapsed. He started having what his pediatrician called emotional shutdown episodes. No one at the table said anything. My daughter called me in February of that year, Richard continued. She was crying. She said she didn't know what to do with him, that he had stopped eating breakfast, stopped wanting to go to school, and that the previous week he had told her he didn't think anyone at school liked him. He paused. He was 8 years old. I remembered Marcus. I remembered him very clearly. A quiet boy with a gap-toothed smile he stopped using around October. I remembered noticing the shift, the way he would arrive in the morning and go directly to his desk without stopping to talk to anyone. The way he would finish his work early and then just sit with his hands folded, looking at nothing in particular. What my daughter didn't know at the time, Richard said, was that his teacher had already noticed. Weeks before anyone said anything to the school, before any formal meetings were scheduled, before my daughter knew how to even start the conversation, his teacher had already pulled Marcus aside. She started eating lunch with him twice a week. She stayed after school on Tuesdays and helped him build a model of the solar system because he had mentioned once that he liked space. She called my daughter one evening, not during school hours, on her own time just to say, "I see him. I want you to know that someone here sees him every day and he matters to us." I hadn't told anyone about those phone calls. I didn't think it was the kind of thing you told people. Richard's voice was steady, but something had shifted in his eyes. By the end of that school year, he said, Marcus was doing better. Not perfectly, things at home were still complicated, but better. He started smiling again. He made 2 close friends. He told my daughter that school was the place where he felt safest. He stopped for a moment. She called me the day of the last day of school and read me the card Marcus had made for his teacher. She was crying when she read it. I think I was too. The table was completely silent. Richard looked at me directly. "I never met you," he said. "But I know what you did for my grandson, and I've thought many times about whether I would ever get the chance to say thank you to the right person." He shook his head slightly. I didn't expect it to happen at an engagement party in Connecticut. A few people near the center of the table were very still. One of Victoria's aunts had pressed her fingers to her lips. Daniel was looking at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between pride and surprise, and something more tender than either of those. I didn't know what to say. I looked at my water glass for a moment, and then back at Richard. "Marcus did the work," I said finally. "I just made sure he knew he wasn't invisible." Richard shook his head. "No," he said simply, "you did more than that. And I think everyone at this table should know it." He looked slowly around the table. Not accusingly, not with any theatrical pause, just clearly, the way someone looks when they want to make sure they've been understood. "You were just introduced as just a teacher," he said. He said it without sharpness, but without softness either, just plainly, the way you state a fact. I want to be clear about something. There is no such thing as just a teacher. Not when a teacher decides a child is worth her personal time, her evening phone calls, her Tuesday lunches. Not when a teacher holds a classroom together for a kid whose home is falling apart. He set his napkin on the table with a quiet finality. The people who shape children are not incidental. They are essential. Victoria had not spoken. Her champagne glass was still in her hand. Her face had gone very still, not pale exactly, but careful, the way a face gets when it's working to stay composed while something uncomfortable is being processed underneath. Daniel stood up from his chair and walked around the table to where I was sitting. He crouched down slightly so we were at eye level and put his hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry I didn't say it first," he said quietly. "I should have." I shook my head. "You didn't know. I should have made it my business to know." He squeezed my shoulder once and stood back up. One of Victoria's relatives, an older woman named Patricia, who I had spoken briefly with earlier in the evening, set her fork down and looked at me. "My granddaughter had a teacher like that," she said simply. "It changed everything for her. I know exactly what this man is describing." She nodded once at Richard, and he nodded back. From further down the table, someone else said quietly, "Teachers are underestimated every single day." Nobody argued with that. I was aware of dozens of eyes on me, and I was not entirely comfortable with it. I have never been particularly good at being the center of attention. It's part of why I became a teacher rather than something more visible. In a classroom, the attention is supposed to be on the children. That's where it belongs. I am more comfortable being the person who notices than the person who is noticed. But sitting there at that table, with Richard across from me and Daniel's hand having just been on my shoulder, I felt something I don't often let myself feel. Not pride exactly, more like relief. The relief of being seen correctly, after a long time of being described incorrectly, by someone who had no reason to make anything up. I was just doing my job, I said again, because it was true and because I didn't know what else to say. Richard smiled for the first time that evening. It was a quiet smile, unhurried. "So was the surgeon who saved my life in 2019, he said. "That doesn't make it small." The party continued. The jazz came back into focus. Waiters reappeared with the next course. Conversations resumed in the gentle, slightly subdued way they do after something real has happened in the middle of something social. People laughed again, wine was refilled, and eventually the Calloway family's event coordinator appeared to announce that cake would be served near the garden fountain. Victoria laughed at appropriate moments for the rest of the evening. She made the right gestures and said the right things. But she didn't look in my direction again for the rest of the night, and when she did once, briefly, when we were both near the dessert table, she looked at me differently than she had before. Not with warmth, not quite, but with something that might have been the very beginning of reconsideration. I drove home alone 2 hours later on the dark highway back toward the city. I thought about Marcus, who would be in 6th grade now, probably taller than I remembered, hopefully still finding reasons to smile. I thought about the card he made at the end of 3rd grade, a folded piece of construction paper with a drawing of the solar system on the front and his handwriting inside that said, simply, "You made school feel safe." "Thank you, Miss Sarah." I had kept that card. It was in my desk drawer at home, under a few other things, in the place where I put things I don't want to lose. I thought about what Richard had said. About essential. About the difference between being incidental and being essential, and how often the people doing the most essential work are the ones most casually described as just a teacher, just a nurse, just a janitor, just a cashier. I thought about my 23 third graders who would be waiting for me Monday morning. About the boy in the back row who still hadn't quite found his footing. About the girl who read 2 grade levels ahead and was quietly bored and needed something more. About the one who came in every single morning and went straight to my desk to show me whatever he had drawn the night before and how much it mattered to him that I looked, really looked, and responded to the specific thing he had made, and not just a general "that's great." I thought about how none of that shows up on a resume the way certain other things do. How it doesn't come with a salary that reflects the weight of it. How it's invisible to the people who haven't seen what happens when it's missing. And I thought about how none of that makes it less true. Sometimes the loudest recognition doesn't come from the place you expected it. It comes from a stranger at a dinner table who watched someone he loved find his way back to himself and remembered exactly who helped him do it. I got home, changed into comfortable clothes, made a cup of tea, and sat for a while in the quiet of my apartment. Monday morning, I would be up at 5:45. I would pack my bag, drive to Lincoln Elementary, and walk into room 14, where 23 children would be waiting. I already couldn't wait. Never dismiss someone because of their job title. The most important work doesn't always come with the most visible label. And the people who show up quietly, day after day, for the people who need them most, they are not just anything. They are everything.